guest tonight is Mr. Derek Brinks. He's an associate director of Fair Food Standard Council, and he has a lot of experience working in designing and implementing audits and investigation methods of the Fair Food Program, which is actually an award-winning human rights program protecting the safety and dignity of agricultural workers. He has served first for several years as an investigator, and he was taking and investigating complaints, interviewing workers, and also drafting compliance assessments. We would like to know more about the program, how it works, what it's like. So I have a couple of questions for you. One is, first, like as an investigator, and now as the Associate Director of the Fair Food Standard Council, can you share with us what are the most common complaints or problems that you have seen out there with A2A agricultural workers, if what we have heard already is all, or if you have heard more about other type of problems, and how they have been resolved. And also we would like to know more about the Fair Food Program, because it seems to be a promising partnership to ensure fair treatment of agricultural workers. So could you describe the objectives also of the program and how it has been implemented?
Thank you, and thank you all for your interest, for being here, for having all of us. Thank you for the questions. So, to start answering those questions, I have to go back to the 1990s, before I was, anywhere near grown, or before the Fair Food Standards Council, the Fair Food Program existed. So in the early 1990s, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, they're a community organization based in Southwest Florida in Immokalee. They were predominantly agricultural workers, mostly tomato workers, and they found themselves in really bad conditions. They had no dignity or respect in the workplace. They were consistently underpaid. Their housing was atrocious. The list went on. And so they started organizing and solving minor problems. And as they started organizing, they started stumbling upon modern day slavery in their workplaces or in their backyards. Literally a chain fence holding people inside, who were being forced to work on a daily basis and not allowed to leave, and being held at gunpoint or locked in box trucks. And so they started solving those problems, and they started working with the DOJ to get those cases prosecuted, get the bad guys put in jail, and yet it happened again and again and again. It happened. I think there were about 10 different forced labor cases in Florida in the 90s and the 2000s. So bad that the DOJ called it ground zero for modern day slavery. So after all that work, and the problem kept resurging, they started thinking about what they could do to prevent those cases, what they could do to improve conditions across the board, so that they weren't out there fixing broken glass, trying to put the broken glass together, right? They weren't out there trying to solve already atrocious conditions. And that's where the idea of the Fair Food Program started, the idea of preventing such terrible conditions. And so they started working on a consumer consciousness campaign, getting people like you all engaged and committed and aware of the problems, and putting pressure on those with the actual power in the supply chain. They had spent time petitioning and striking against the employers, the growers themselves, and that didn't really get anywhere because they were being squeezed from the top. So they started looking at the top. They started looking at Taco Bell and McDonald's and Burger King and grocery store retailers and catering services, and bringing consumer consciousness and pressure to bear on those with the power in that supply chain, brought those retailers and those fast food chains to the table to make meaningful, legally binding commitments to only source Fair Food Program produce, and to cut off purchases from growers who are not complying or not participating in the program. And that's how it got started. In our organization, the Fair Food Standards Council, we opened in 2011, and our mandate is to monitor the program, to monitor the code of conduct and enforce those standards on participating farms in the program. We started in Florida in tomatoes, and slowly started building up systems on those growers until they were in better shape. We have an auditing process. David was already talking about that, where we go out to the growers at least once a year and interview at least 50% of the workforce. We have bilingual, multilingual staff out there doing those interviews, talking to people in the fields while they're working or at housing afterwards. And then we also have a complaint mechanism where people can complain productively so that their concerns can be heard and their suggested solutions can be put in place. We work collaboratively with our growers to find a resolution to complaints or a corrective action for audit findings that works for them, that can fit in with their operation. So it's not just telling them what to do, it's what can we do together to fix this problem. And I also, we're talking a lot about H2A. Back in the 90s, H2A was not nearly as popular. And we have seen, even though in our context, we've seen a lot of enormous sea change improvements in the Florida tomato industry. We've now gone up the East Coast of the US in tomatoes. We've started expanding out here in Colorado and elsewhere. But outside of the program, the problems persist, and the H2A program in particular is ripe for abuse. It's way too easy when you're bringing people from outside of the country who don't understand the local communities, who don't know where they are often, don't speak the language. It's way too easy to take advantage of them. And so even recently, 2 years ago, there was a very large forced labor operation in Georgia where the DOJ called it the Operation Blooming Onion, with tens of thousands of H2A workers who were being forced to work, who were not being paid, who were held at gunpoint. Some died, some were sexually assaulted. It was horrendous, and that was 2 years ago in Georgia. Just last year, there was a case in watermelons in Florida where people were being forced to work. So that continues to happen, not on our farms though. So to answer your question about what kind of issues do we see, I think it is very cool. It's been very cool for me to spend the last 9 years working in our program. And I've seen, I get to keep track of our data, and so I've seen how our complaints, while the number of complaints that we get has stayed about the same. And I think it was cool to hear what David said about, we'll still get complaints in the future. That's gonna happen, hopefully, if there's good communication between workers and our organization and growers. People will continue to complain, but the severity of those complaints, how bad they are, whether they're actually big problems or if they're just kind of minor issues that we can solve more easily, that severity's gone down drastically and continues to go down. So the kind of problems that we've been focusing on lately have been more health and safety related. I'd say, and in the last few years, we've really been emphasizing heat stress as our Earth gets hotter. farm workers are on the front lines that protect workers from the risks of heat illness. And so that includes during a certain time of year, the hot season, that includes regular 10-minute breaks every few hours to make sure that everyone stops and takes a break so that there's not continued competition. Making sure that there's shade everywhere. Shade is newly enshrined in law in Colorado, but in almost everywhere else, especially not Florida, there is no law requiring that shade be provided to people. So that's been, 10 years ago, shade in Florida was kind of a revolution. But it makes a huge difference for people. They can take a break in the shade, and especially if they're not feeling well. So making sure that that's all available, making sure that people can take their breaks on a regular basis so that there's a schedule. And in other sorts of violations we find, I mean, really they have not been nearly so bad, but there's still verbal abuse. People are people, and in a tense environment, there's still some times where people can be abusive with their language. But it has been really encouraging for us to see how we don't see sexual harassment all the time anymore. We don't see discrimination or systemic wage theft. People get paid consistently and accurately and on time. People are respected. People get to go home to an adequate housing. I mean, housing law for migrant workers is not good, but it's they at least have a mechanism for reporting when there's a repair that's needed, or if the water isn't working, or whatever. And so seeing all that, seeing those improvements, really I think goes back to the way that the program is structured, that takes farm workers saying that their bosses are doing the right thing, bosses who are committed to that, and then retailers or fast food chains, those at the top of the supply chain, making a meaningful, legally binding commitment to source from those growers, to preferentially purchase from those growers that are doing the right thing. Because without that hook, without that consequence, without that incentive, there's not going to be a change. And so that's, if you don't remember anything else, it's that standards without enforcement is meaningless, and that enforcement, as far as we've found, can be really effective coming from the top of the supply chain, using market consequences or market incentives to improve conditions for farm workers.
I have more questions, but it's time to open the floor for the question from the public. What is the logo that we need to look for to help producers?
It's green. There's some. I could describe it. It's a worker with a bucket, with a green field rows in the field behind them, and there are brochures out. I believe on the table. Tom set them out for me. There are brochures out there giving you some data, some facts on the program's impact, as well as a bit more of a narrative. And I'm certain that at least one of those has the label on it.